Some stories begin in the warm middle of a house with bread on a table and a fire that has been kept going for a long time. This one does not. This one begins on a winter mountain in old Japan, where the snow fell every evening, and where, halfway up the slope, a single small cottage sent up a single thin line of smoke. A man lived there alone. He was a weaver. He owed money to the lord at the bottom of the mountain, and money to the merchant in the lowland town. And on most nights he sat by his small fire and listened to the silence of his own loom in the next room, the silence of a debt that he did not know how to pay. This is the story of how, for one winter, his loom learned to sing. And of the morning he listened at the door and looked and learned what the singing had cost. The weaver was coming up the mountain path one evening with a bundle of dry pine wood on his back when he heard, very faintly, the sound of a wing beating against snow. He set down the bundle. He stepped off the path, and there, in the half-light under a low pine, he found a tall white crane caught by one leg in a hunter's snare. The crane did not cry out. The crane only watched him with quiet, dark eyes. The weaver knelt in the snow. He worked the knot loose with his cold fingers, and he lifted the line away from the long, thin leg, and he stepped back. For a long moment, the white crane did not move. It stood and looked at him, the way a person looks at a person. Then it lifted very slowly into the gray sky, and it flew off down the valley until it was only a small white shape against the falling snow, and then nothing at all. The weaver picked up his bundle of wood. He told no one what he had done. He went home. That night, the wind got up on the mountain in a way the wind should not have done in that season. The weaver was sitting by his small fire with a bowl of plain rice in his hand when there came a knock at the cottage door, very soft, 3 times. He set the bowl down. He went to the door. On the step stood a young woman in a plain white robe, with no cloak against the cold, her long hair pale in the lamplight, snow on her shoulders. She bowed once. She asked, very quietly, for shelter from the storm. The weaver let her in. He gave her his place by the fire. He gave her the bowl of rice. She slept that night on his single mat, and he slept on the floor in front of the loom room door. And in the morning, the storm had not gone. She stayed 3 days. She stayed 7. She stayed all the long weeks of winter. By the first soft afternoon of spring, when the snow on the path had begun to thin, she was his wife. They were happy that spring in a quiet way. She was a careful housekeeper. She did not speak very much, but when she did speak, what she said was kind. One morning, near the end of the first warm month, she came and sat in front of him by the small fire, and she folded her hands in her lap and she said, "Husband, I would like to weave for you. I will weave a bolt of cloth that you can sell at the Lord's gate at the bottom of the mountain, and the gold from it will pay one of your debts. But you must promise me one thing." The weaver nodded. "While I am at the loom," she said, "you must not open the door. You must not look in upon me at the loom. Not once. Not for any reason. Will you promise me that?" The weaver promised. She went into the loom room. She slid the door closed behind her. She put down the latch. And all that day, and into the long evening and through most of the next day, he heard the soft, steady rhythm of the loom on the other side of the door, and he sat by his fire, and he did not open it. On the 3rd morning she came out, very pale, and she laid in his lap a folded bolt of white cloth. The cloth was so fine and so strangely woven that when he carried it down to the Lord at the foot of the mountain, the Lord stood up from his chair, and the Lord paid him in gold. A second bolt followed in the warm months. She wove again for 3 days behind the closed door, while the weaver sat by his fire and kept his promise. She came out paler still. He sold the second bolt in the lowland town, and the gold from it paid every debt the weaver carried in the world. He came home up the mountain with the empty purse and an open heart, and he said to his wife, "It is done. We owe nothing now. We need never weave another bolt." She smiled at him. She did not say very much. 2 weeks later, the merchant from the lowland town climbed the mountain path himself, in his fine wool traveling robes, and he stood in the door of the cottage and he asked, very politely, for one more bolt. The lord in the next province had heard of the cloth. The price would be twice what the first 2 bolts had paid together. Only one more bolt. Of course, only one more. The weaver, who was kind and who loved his wife, came back to the fire and asked. His wife was quiet for a long moment. She looked once at the closed door of the loom room, then she said, "Yes, husband. One more. But this is the last. Remember the rule." She went into the loom room. She slid the door closed. She put down the latch. And this time, when the soft, steady rhythm of the loom began on the other side of the door, it did not stop. It went on all that first day, and through the night, and through the next day, and through the next night. The weaver sat by his fire and listened. He told himself that the third bolt was simply finer than the first 2, and so it took longer. On the third day, he heard her cough, once, very softly, behind the closed door. On the 4th day, he heard nothing for a long time, and then the loom began again, more slowly than before. On the 5th morning, his heart cold inside him, the weaver got up. He went to the door of the loom room. He stood and listened for a moment with his ear against the wood, and what he heard he could not make sense of. Then, very quietly, he slid the door open 1 finger's width. He looked. There was no woman in the room. There was, at the loom, a tall white crane, very thin now, plucking the long white feathers one by one from her own breast and feeding them into the warp. She finished the bolt that evening. She came out of the loom room slowly in the plain white robe, very thin and very pale, and she laid the 3rd bolt on the small wooden table in front of the fire. The weaver was on his knees. He could not look up at her. He said her name. He said, "Please." She bent down. She touched his hair very lightly one time. She said, "Husband, you looked." And what is given in love is unmade by demand. I cannot stay now that you have seen what I am. She straightened. She walked across the small room and she opened the cottage door and she stepped out into the soft white falling snow. The weaver got up. He came to the door. He stood in the open doorway with the cold air against his face. And he watched a single tall white shape go up from the garden path into the gray sky, smaller and smaller, until it was only a white mark against the falling snow. And then nothing at all. He went back into the cottage. After a long while, he got up and he walked to the door of the loom room and he slid it open. The room was very quiet. The loom stood empty. The stool stood empty. And in the warp of the loom, caught up among the last fine threads of the cloth she had not finished, was one long white feather. Some stories, the people on that mountain say, are kept by what they end with. By an empty stool. By an open door. By a single white feather caught in a loom. This was Forgotten Fables. Follow the channel when you want the next story the loud world forgot.